Shola Sky Islands, which has been the place where I've worked largely. And this is mostly going to be on the biogeography and evolution of birds. But these topics tend to be a little bit very narrow or specific, and we will discuss that. But broadly, it kind of relates to biodiversity itself and how biodiversity is created, and and hopefully I'll also try and tell you about how it may be lost. Uh, so if you haven't seen the Shola landscape, the Shola Sky Island landscape, this image that you see, that is what the Shola habitat looks like. Maybe some of you have seen it in the highest reaches of Western Ghats. It has a natural kind of patchy habitat with forests and grasslands. And the mountain on the extreme left, that is the highest mountain in the Western Ghats, the Animudi. So before I go on, I want to kind of, thanks to COVID, since we were in a lockdown, I managed to kind of put my lab website together. So it's kind of fully renovated, and you guys can take a look if those who are interested to see, what we do, who are in the lab, and what are the major themes of research. That's all there on this website that you can see a link to. And there are four major themes of research in the lab. One is landscape ecology, others evolution, biogeography, and bioacoustics. So I will try and cover these three themes. I'm not going to get into citizen science and outreach part, but you'll get a kind of flavor of what's happening. And there's a whole bunch of fantastic bird-motivated people in the lab as well. So let's get back to Sky Islands. So one of the most common questions that I get is, what are Sky Islands? And I think that this is really very nicely captured by this image by Prasenjit, the other a brilliant photographer. And you can see that this is a green meteor, but that is of not of real relevance to this image. But you can see these mountains that are isolated, and at the valleys, you have a different kind of habitat and largely occupied by people, by humans. So these mountain tops tend to become like islands. And that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm sure that everybody has heard of islands, some way or the other. Even in school, I think you would have, you've read of Darwin's theories and how this adaptive radiation happens on these isolated oceanic islands. And if you remember, the classic Darwin's finches figures, with the different beak sizes and shapes and so on. So that's the classic thing that happens with islands. You have speciation and adaptive radiation. But the question is that this is not the only way islands operate. You can have different kinds of islands. You can have, of course, the first example that you see on the top. That is the oceanic islands that I talked about. But the second example that you see is water bodies that are isolated by land, or it can also be forests that are isolated by deforestation. And finally, at the bottom, you see these mountain tops that are isolated from each other by just low elevation valleys. So that is the Sky Island kind of concept that I'm talking about. So here, actually, the main principle, the main thing that is operating here is isolation, and that is just actually physically being separated from each other. And this can happen in different ways. It can happen at different geographic scales. So you can have islands that are separated like, considerably, very far from each other. There's another point which is very important, which is time. So ideally, for processes like speciation and evolutionary changes to occur, you need a lot of time for populations that are isolated to kind of develop these changes and adapt and so on. So there are these two important things: time and space, in which isolation really operates. And this is what we've been trying to kind of understand. So I think everybody knows where Western Ghats are. I'm pretty sure that that's quite clear. But you kind of see that there's this low elevation valley called Palghat Gap. I don't think you can see my cursor, but anyway, uh, it's a valley towards the south, wide valley, and that's called Palghat Gap. I'm sure you'll see it in the subsequent slides. And this is a very characteristic break in the Western Ghat Mountains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a fly through which follows this line along the ridge of the Western Ghats, and each of these dots are my sampling locations. Um, and it also has some of these gaps that I was talking about. So let's just start. And this is the very south, which is going from the very tip of the south. And you have on the right, you can see the dry habitats, and you can see the mountain tops there. This first green dot is a Shenkota gap. That's a very narrow valley. And as you go further, you see the high Veris mountains, and again you see the dry habitat at the foothills. There's a mid-elevation plateau here that rises to the Munnar landscape. There's a lot of tea. Anemudi is over there, and that's a Shola habitat, the grassland forest over there. And this kind of plunges down into this 40-kilometer wide valley. It's a very deep, wide valley before it rises up again to form this Nilgiris mountain. And you can see the Shola habitat there. These are these mountain tops that actually form the sky islands of Western Ghats. So what you've got a kind of a big picture overview. But why does this matter? So we remember we talked about isolation. So we're talking about these mountain-like things that are separated from each other, and the blue dots being like these isolated habitats. And one of the common questions I get is, so why does this, so birds can fly. So what if the mountains are a little bit isolated from each other? So this is a common, I would say, misconception because uh, the problem is scale. If you remember, I was talking about scale. So some of the mountains are actually quite distant. They are quite far apart. Then not all birds are alike. I'm sure you've heard of, distance as the crow flies and things like that. And that really, very few birds really fly like the crow flies. So you can have very small bodied other species of birds with different ecologies, and they won't be able to fly the same way as crows do. They just simply do not. So, and of course, in today's world, you know that islands are actually maybe quite complicated with different kinds of uh, configurations of islands that are there today. So, this is another view of the same mountain tops that you saw earlier. The areas in brown are the high elevation areas. So these are the sky islands, okay? And you can see that there are some really large sky islands, the brown ones, the big brown ones. And the Palghat Gap is written there, and so is Shenkota Gap. Uh, so what's interesting is within any one of these islands, also you find a lot of deforestation. And I will come to this and explain this in a little bit more detail. But the point is that the natural habitats today, even within one island, are further isolated from each other. So it's almost like islands within islands that is happening there. All right. So what's the big deal about the landscape itself? I think some of the important things are that habitats themselves are different. So it's very wet and cool habitats is what is there in these mountain tops. So if you're going to UP or Kodaikanal or any of these landscapes, you'll actually you'll understand what I'm talking about. It's very humid and it's cold, as opposed to lower elevations where it may get humid, but it's never quite as cold. And a lot of these habitats actually support the origin of several rivers. Most of the South Indian rivers actually originate on these mountains. Important habitat. Uh, so this figure, I'm going to try to explain very quickly. The x-axis is just latitude, and towards the right is the tip, the southern tip of India, and you can go north from there as you go from from your right to the left, and then elevation is on the y-axis. So this will match the fly through that we did, and you will notice that we only flew through until about the Baba Budan Hills of Brahmagiri actually. So now there are two major things that I want you to look at and focus on in this graph. One is that the red arrows point to the deepest valleys in the system. Okay, so these are these Palghat Gap, Shenkota Gap, and you can see that the elevation it's steeply falling in these places. So for the first part, we wanted to look at the genetic impact of these valleys. So what we did was we very crudely we divided this high elevation Western Ghats into four blocks: A, B, C, and D, separated by these where those red dots are. I mean the red arrows are. So you can imagine, and I'm sure that if you've done some kind of if you've built some, it doesn't have to be phylogenetic trees, but if you've looked at ancestry or pedigrees, you will understand how these trees work. Excuse me. So essentially, uh, if so, you consider a scenario. The simple scenario that birds can fly everywhere. The equivalent of that hypothesis is what is on your extreme right, which shows that all the four mountains A, B, C, and D, they are all mixed. Okay, so there is no phylogenetic difference between these between individuals across the mountains. They're able to kind of move across and so on. And on the extreme left is the other opposite scenario where the species is not able to fly across even any of the barriers. So you find A, B, C, and D being phylogenetically distinct. And of course, the two population and three population comes somewhere in between. Yeah, so these were the kind of hypotheses that we wanted to test. But we wanted to do this for the entire community of birds. So what we did was, okay, first things first. I don't really want you to know the names of these birds for the. I mean, if you know them, that's great. But for the purposes of this talk, I think the most important thing is to focus on some of the ecological factors. For example, some birds with the stars on them, they are endemic to the Western Ghats, and some are to the Sky Islands itself. Then you notice that some birds are actually very small. The black and orange flycatcher, the top row second, is actually only 9 grams, 9 grams big. But the Nilgiri wood pigeon, which is the second row, the first on the second row, that is actually a very heavy bird. So you can see that there are different sizes. There are some flycatchers. I think everybody recognizes the red-whiskered bulbul. It's probably around you. And there are some grassland birds like pipits. So the question is, there's a different set of ecologies of birds that we were studying, and we wanted to see what kinds of birds are affected by these gaps, or yeah, and which are not. Okay, so this is my collaborator Vishnu. So Vishnu and I actually spent a lot of time going up these mountains. We put up these special mist nets that you see on the top right, and we catch these birds and take a little drop of blood from them. So coincidentally, some of my students were in Orissa doing some field work for birds over there, and maybe in 2 years we will know a little bit more about the diversity of birds there. But anyway, so once we had this drop of blood, we were able to kind of obtain genetic sequences from it. And to quickly summarize, I'm not going to show you like 24 phylogenetic trees, but let me put this in perspective of the landscape. So at the bottom, you see the same, this profile, right? It's like a cross section of the Western Ghats, and you're looking at it from the side. You see the Palghat Gap, Shenkuta Gap, and the Chalaya River. So these are the three major valleys with the A, B, C, D, the four blocks. So the red line on top, a continuous red line, means that the simplest hypothesis that the birds can fly everywhere. So 14 species actually could fly everywhere. So 14 of the 24. But what's interesting is that 10 of the 24 were actually divided by the Palghat Gap, which is the deepest valley, and a few others by Shankuta Gap, and another set of species at the Chaliar Valley. So um, I know this can get a little bit confusing, but if you were to think about it, there were 10 species, 10, let's say 10 taxa actually that are phylogenetically impacted at the Palghat Gap, and only three by the Shenkuta Gap and one by the Chaliar Valley. So this shows some kind of a nested effect in the sense that if somebody asks you, so where do you find genetic breaks in birds in the Western Ghats, you can say the most important one is Palghat Gap because that affects more number of species than the Shenkuta or the other gaps, right? Um, but because we had this genetic data, we could go one step further. We could also look at the age or the divergence time. And interestingly, what we find is that the oldest divergences were always at the Palghat Gap. You can see the blue bubble matches with the Palghat Gap, and the orange is the Shenkuta Gap. Yeah, so you can see the slide now, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah, the moment you're not able to see this, please flag it so that I
Sure,
don't lose
sure,
it. Okay, so yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to highlight that Palghat gap is the most like it results in the oldest divergence and it impacts more number of species than the other gaps. And uh, yeah, so this is a little bit tricky, but I'm sure that if you stay engaged, I can probably try and explain this. On the y-axis of this is the divergence time at Palghat Gap in millions of years. And just these are different species that are there. The names of the species don't matter. What I'm trying to show here is that a lot of species actually diverged in this 2.5 million years. Some are older, of course, and we will deal with those separately. I will come to those separately. But these, the rest, the other eight, they're all in this Pleistocene period. Pleistocene is the recent 2.5 million year time point. And the interesting point about this time is that you see this figure. This is historic climate, which is fluctuating. The blue line is just fluctuating quite a lot. And I can see that in 2.5 million years, the last 2.5 million years, the right part of the graph, there have been a lot more of fluctuations. So basically, climate has been changing very rapidly. Okay, now how does that actually affect? Uh, so now that we have understood that at this time there's a lot of climatic fluctuation, how does this affect the birds in the Western Ghats? So we can take an example of the ice age, and I think everybody knows what ice age is, right? Except that in the Western Ghats, of course, there were no mammoths, but apart from that, we never had this glaciation that was there in the northern latitudes. What happened in the Western Ghats was that everything just became more dry, and when things dry up, the forests kind of contract, and so this is not just in Western Ghats, but all the tropical mountain areas. You know that the forests actually contracted into small kind of refugia. So that's what we think happened in this landscape. So you can imagine that you have the mountains as the topography, as the background, and then climate is actually moving things up and down. Okay, so you can imagine that like once when everything was cool, maybe the birds occupied the entire landscape, but then they started moving up. As they moved up, they got first they got isolated at Palghat Gap, right? And then as the climate changed further, it went up further and it got isolated at the other gaps. Now you can imagine that when the climate changes back, again, the shallow gaps get connected first, and the deep ones actually take a long time to connect because the climate has to change and the habitat has to come down. So it's a slow process, so it takes a lot of time. So only when the habitat actually moves down to Palghat Gap, that is when the birds cross, because these kinds of birds are very tied to their habitats. So uh, so now we have a fairly good understanding of how species are created in the Western Ghats. So it is topography, but not just topography by itself. It's topography with climate. So the climate is what is moving the habitat up and down, resulting in the birds kind of getting diverged. Okay. Now, remember the two species that I told you I will come to in detail. One of them is this bird called, it was called the shortwing, and I continue to call it shortwing, but actually, it's not related to the shortwings of the Himalayas. We had to place it in a new genus called Sholicola, and it's about 10 million years old. So it's an ancient kind of a species. The other group is laughing thrushes, another species which has, it was thought to have relatives in the Western Ghat, I mean, in the Himalayas, but it doesn't. That's not the case. This is also a very different species, genus itself, and we had to erect a new genus called Montesincla for that. So if you take both of these together, what it looks like is that these sky islands actually have different species on the different mountains. So we have, what our genetic data shows is that there are actually 7 different species on these different mountain tops. And the two genus there were also turned out to be very unique. So this is really interesting. Now, if you may now remember that when we're talking about radiations in the Galapagos Islands or something like that, you saw something similar. So all I'm trying to say here is that these habitat islands, these mountain tops, are very much like islands where you find speciation happening, on these different isolated habitat areas. Now, I just want to show you one of the phylogenetic trees of this species, and you can see the taxa that is highlighted, that is in bold. That is the Montesincla, the laughing thrushes. You can see that it's actually very different from Garrulax and Trocalipteron and so on that it was supposed to be close to. And this is what actually made us erect a new genus for this taxa. So this so it does show that there are some unique taxa in the Western Ghats on these mountain tops. So I want to not just say that this is not the case only with birds. Actually, this is a great study by a colleague, S.P. Vijaykumar, who was at IIC, and he worked on Rhacophoros frogs almost exactly in the same places where I was working, and his sampling also had low elevation to high elevation. And as you can imagine, when we're talking about how birds can fly and how those generalizations don't hold, very similarly, you can imagine that within frogs, there are different kinds of frogs. There are some very specialized frogs, and in these, what Vijay showed was that you have speciation happening even within a mountain. So you have high elevation being different from low elevation, and even on the mountaintop, you have like a grassland frog and a forest frog and so on. And of course, you have them being isolated by mountains as well. So this is excellent. So this shows that isolation can actually happen in different ways for different species. And remember, I told you that for birds, 10 million year old divergence is very old. But it turns out these Rhacophoros frogs are actually 30 million years or so old. Uh, so that is that different taxa have been isolated for different periods of time on this landscape, right? And this is another example, and it's a very recent example. The Xylophysne wood snake, another colleague Deepak, and some other colleagues of his were sitting on a mountaintop very close to where my first image, the starting image I showed you, that was Ereviculum, and they noticed this snake, and then they found that when they got the samples and they did a very nice elaborate study comparing the snakes on different sky islands, and they found that they're actually very different. So I'm sure you can look up this study. So what I want to say here is that Of course, Western Ghats is a biodiversity hotspot, and it's probably one of the best studied hotspots in India. But new species still continue to be discovered. And when my paper came out, I just compiled all the uh, other data that was coming through at the very same time. And you can see that there are a number of birds and frogs and plants, all of which was kind of being discovered at the same, just in 1 year. So it just goes to show that there's a lot more research to be done, even in some of the best studied landscapes. So in places like where you are, around Berhampur and Orissa, uh, there is very little data on biodiversity. So I think it's great for students to kind of you know get out and start exploring and looking around. Anyway, so now I want to come to the second part of my talk, and these are going to be more summaries. I'm not going to go into as much detail. Uh, so once again, we start with this idea of where the sky islands are, and you can see that these have been kind of divided into three big blocks: A, B, and C. And B is the large habitats. The what do you say? That has the maximum area. The ones numbered 6, 7, and 8. Okay. So what we did was here a postdoc of mine, Arsumani, he has been trying to map the landscape change. So he took the satellite imagery of one of these areas, the Nilgiris. So there's a title on top, and it says it's 1973. So he took this imagery from 1973, and he tried to assess how much natural forest and natural grassland was there at that time. So that's the light green and the dark green. Also, pay attention to the pink and the reddish color. The pink is a tea estate, and the red is timber plantation. So, what is timber plantation? Timber plantation is eucalyptus, it's acacia, it's pine. So, all of these exotic species, mostly from Australia, and they were planted here for timber for various economic purposes. So, just focus on the red and how the red kind of changes through time. So I'm going to play this and it's going to play on a loop. It's an animation. So you have 1973 now, and 95 and 2017. I hope you can see this. So if you can see this, you can see that the red is kind of increasing as you go from 73 to 95 to 2017. And this is the other mountain in the Anamalais and Palnis. Again, 1973, the same legend. And here you have to see that at 1973, actually large parts of the landscape, there were grasslands. And yeah, that's 95 and 2017. So you can see how much of the landscape has changed, going from 73 to recent times, right? So what's happened is that remember we talked about this idea of islands within islands, this fragmentation. So fragmentation has kind of happened in this landscape, and different uh, areas within the same mountain have become isolated. So, and this has happened over a century. So I'm not going to discuss this in detail, but we also collected genetic data from across the landscape. And what we find is that there has been further isolation of population. This is just one species that we did. Within the landscape, these populations have been isolated. I don't want to go into the details because we'll get stuck with the methods and so on. Um, so 100 to 150 years itself, across the landscape, there has been some genetic impact. The third aspect of what I wanted to talk to you about is just one slide. That is studying cultural differences with bird song. So I think that uh, everybody has heard birds sing, but I think what people forget to kind of recognize is that bird song is actually a lot like language. It's a lot like human language. In the sense that birds learn this from their neighbors, from their parents. So there's a social learning that is involved. So it's not like genes that is kind of transferred from generation to generation. This can get transferred even horizontally. Okay, so within the same generation, you can take a bird from one population, put it somewhere else, and they can learn a different song. Very similar to how humans, if it doesn't matter where you were born, you stay in Orissa for 10 years, you're going to pick up the language there as well. So what we find, so one of my students actually went across the landscape collecting songs of this one species, and what she found was that the songs are actually on different mountains are very different, and that was, of course, kind of established. It's a known pattern for various birds across the world. But what was unique was that the certain song parameters that were different across anthropogenic changes, anthropogenically isolated islands, were different from the ones that were naturally isolated. So across Palghat Gap, for example, the variable that changed was something else, and within one of the mountains, on an island, birds isolated by just deforestation, the parameter was different. Okay, and to, I mean, if you really want to think about it, that parameter was more related to frequency, and I'm sure all of you have heard of studies where people say anthropogenic noise affects bird song. In most of the studies, what they show is that there is a shift in the frequency of the bird song. And this happens largely because the frequency part of bird song is fairly plastic. So birds are able to kind of adapt very rapidly to frequency shifts. Okay. So yeah. So now what we are doing is that I want to kind of step back and look at the larger picture. Remember that we were talking just only about the southern, very small part of the Western Ghats earlier. If you look at the tip, it's from SCU southwards, and that was all the story I was telling you was from there. So now what we want to do is expand that study, but uh, you know that becomes a little bit tricky because it's a large landscape, a lot more species. And the way that we thought of doing this was, of course, look for these barriers. So there are no other Palghat gaps. There are a few other geographic gaps. But what we decided to do was we try to look for differences in birds. Okay. And this is interesting because bird watchers are actually very good at spotting little differences, a little bit of red more on some birds, on some feathers, on the wing or something like that. And they say, oh yeah, this looks very different from, the other side of another river. So what we did was we actually quantified how many of these bird races, just morphological differences, occur at different geographical points. And then we were able to kind of analyze that. And you see the red bars, that is where most turnover happens. So the turnover means, okay, you take one pair of species, that shows a difference, so that is one. And then another pair, and then another pair. And then you look at it across hundreds of species, and you find that most changes happen at these red bars. So you'll notice that south of Mahanadi, south of Orissa, actually has one of the important barriers, and so does just north of Goa. So this is very interesting because Palghat Gap. I was telling you till now that Palghat Gap is very important. But if you look at the bigger picture, Palghat Gap doesn't turn out to be that important. So I have a feeling that once we start collecting genetic data, and that's what my students are doing currently. They were just now at Simlipal, and they're on their way back to Tirupati now. We've been collecting samples from all across this landscape, and hopefully we will have a better idea of the diversity and how these birds are actually diverging across these mountains, maybe in a few years at least. The samples are just beginning to come through. So I want to end by first thanking my postdoc advisor, Umar Ramakrishnan, where some of this work happened. And a lot of the amazing pictures that you see is by the second person on the photo, that is Prasenjit Yadav. And of course, I already showed you a large number of my teammates who are part of the group. I'd also encourage you to kind of look up the website and find, there are some popular kind of stories that are written about the research that I did, and I welcome you to go take a look at those as well. So yeah, that's about it. And I actually wanted to leave a lot more time for discussions and interactions uh, if you have questions.
So thank you, Dr. Robin. That was a tour of India, I guess. We are just realizing how beauty is India and how much research we can do within our country. So now let's have questions. Let's take questions one by one. If anybody is having questions, please feel to ask. Just unmute yourself and have a chat with Robinson.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, this is T.R. Rao.
Hello, sir. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, we met in Mohali.
Yes, 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 yes. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, okay. I'm now visiting faculty here in Aysar Berhampur. Yeah, I'm just curious. When you talked about the sky islands and you were looking at the birds, their genetic divergence, were you looking at concurrently each species diversity and their phenologies changing over time?
Uh, no, sir. Unfortunately, not. I mean, at some point we wanted to look at concordance between the habitat change along with the bird. So basically, it's
Yeah.
the like you correctly point out that it's the habitat that is actually changing and getting diverging, and the birds are just responding to that habitat being to changing. But I think that the only person who's doing any work on plant genetics is, of course, Ullasa in ISA Trivandrum. And I'm really hoping that there's some data that comes out from his lab that can shed some light. But at the moment, I haven't looked at. There is no data, and I haven't done that either.
On these island tops, with the sky island tops, would the diversity of tree species be very different or more or less similar?
Uh, Yeah, that's an interesting question, sir. Actually, what seems to happen across various taxa is that the overall diversity of any taxa is not very high on these mountain tops, but the endemism is high. So there are very few species, but whatever species that are there are specialists adapted to this habitat. So you see a lot of convergence on the mountain tops. So you have the same community repeating on the different mountains because of this, because of the habitat convergence that is happening.
Let us say that you are looking at tops between the Palghat gap,
Yeah,
say the mountain top A and B, and what is the extent or magnitude of similarity in the tree species community between these two tops?
I think there should be more than 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and in
And
it's even
yeah,
more.
okay, yeah. Another question I have is when you say that there is a gap, say Palghat gap, but what would be the as the crow flies distance between these two peaks?
Yes, yeah. This is a very interesting point that you brought up, because the actual distance, Palghat Gap is somewhat wide. It's 40 kilometers. But if you look at Shankuta Gap, it's less than 10 kilometers. I mean, you can stand in the Shankuta Gap and you'll see the mountains on either side.
Right.
But for some reason, these birds don't cross that gap. So there is some behavioral response also, I think, which is involved in this. That they do not behave like crows that just fly straight. They always follow the topography. So they need to go down and then they would come up.
So
Uh,
this is what brings me to the question. There is a difference between they can fly but they do not versus
yes,
they cannot fly.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. You've hit the nail right on the head. Yeah.
So suppose now some transplantation experiments are done, taking the bird from this peak to the other peak. I mean, theoretical, hypothetical.
Yes. Yes.
What will happen? Would there be some kind of a competition in the same habitat, interspecific, or
Uh, uh, I, it's a bit difficult to think of that, but for sure there would be competition, and for sure they would not be able to come back. Like if you take them across Palghat Gap, they are unlikely to come back. Uh, but having said that, there are quite a few examples of some of these birds getting windswept.
uh,
Like there's a grassland bird that was found in Point Calumet by BNHS people. Uh, so some strange things have happened in that sense. Yeah.
now, if, for instance, the birds cannot fly for various reasons, would there be equal differentiation and changes in the species diversity that one could say that it's not only geographic isolation, but habitat differentiation also that is contributing to potential speciation?
Uh, I would think this is more not so much adaptive in that
Um,
sense. I think it is just drift and like very classic allopatry as far as I can see. But these things about adaptation are not very easy. Uh, I mean, to prove or disprove. So I would just say that at the moment, I don't have any evidence for adaptation, and hence I think it is drift. But maybe with additional research, maybe something will show up.
Okay, my final question. Suppose you compare the Eastern Ghats and Western Ghats.
Yes,
I see that you're just beginning to do some explorations on the East Coast.
yes,
Uh, would this type of divergence, and because I don't think there are any clearly well marked sky islands on the Eastern Ghats,
that's right. That's right.
right?
Yeah.
So bird divergence might be related to more than the sky islands pattern or theory, but maybe related to something else.
Yeah, so I'm very curious about this because if you look at the absolute numbers of species that are showing differences in races, some of the ones near Orissa and near Goa, those areas seem to show a bigger divergence. But I can't test for magnitude of each species because I don't have the genetic data yet.
Yeah.
So maybe in a year or two, I think the trick is in looking at the wet forests. So you have in Orissa, you have some of these relict wet patches of habitat
Yeah.
which remain, and that is probably going to be like a habitat island more than a mere sky island.
Yeah, I suppose ultimately these things might be able to explain the big difference in the general overall species diversity between Eastern Ghats and Western Ghats.
Yes, 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 yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh, so, any more questions? So, if anybody is facing any mic problem or connectivity problem, feel free to test in the chat box. So we can just read out the question and answer
Hi, Ravin.
to that.
I had one question. You told that there is some birds can't fly from one side of the Palghat Gap to the another. So,
Right.
this conclusion is based on like the genetic divergence studies, or you have
That's
done some mark and recap studies.
no genetic divergence. Mark recapture would not. The problem with okay, fine. So I can answer. Short answer is that it is genetic data with which I was I explained that divergence. But to kind of elaborate, uh, the thing about some of these birds is that they have strong phylopatry, which means that they stick around in their natal territories for a very long time. So if you do a market capture study, some of these birds will just turn up in the same places for 4 years. Only dispersal happens, um, uh, at the subadult stage. So it will be very difficult to get movement by dispersal across the landscape also. But that was just aside. I mean, the specific answer to your question is that the divergences were all from genetic data.
Yes.
So
Sure.
I have one question. So to develop the genetic data, is it always you capture the bird and collect the blood, or do you collect feather or say excretory? Because in Uma's lab,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
deal with that.
that's right. Unfortunately, it's very poor quality data, and we tried it. Like inspired by Uma, we did try to do this from feathers, and then I quickly gave up because it's much easier to kind of catching birds. Fortunately, it's not like tigers, so you just put up a mist net and you get the birds
Yeah.
very easily and very quickly. So it's not difficult at all. It just takes some skill to understand how the birds fly, what their habits are, and then if you're able to put up the nets in the right places, yeah, getting the blood samples just 10 minutes, from the capture time, take the blood, measure everything, release it. So yeah.
Yeah. So any more questions?
So
I have a
I have a
question.
question. Oh, okay. You
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Robin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Just wonderful. And thanks to the Lavida team for getting you finally. So I just have one question. This is kind of following on from what Professor Rao was mentioning
Right.
about the transplantation experiment. So forgive my ignorance. Are birds territorial? Like, do they tend to, like, if not considering it as an experimental activity, but do you have evidence where, say, because of deforestation, some birds end up in a new territory and then the inhabitants don't really like them to stay there? Has this happened during evolution or in
Yeah.
history?
Uh, yeah. So yes, the specific answers are that yeah, all of these birds that I was showing you data from, all of them are resident territorial birds. So they're not migratory birds, which would show some very different trends. And the second part of the question was about habitat disturbance. So there is this. One of the things that happens with disturbance is that it creates these suboptimal habitats, and they turn out to be, sometimes you may find higher density of individuals there, but they have low survival. So which means that it's almost like if we were to go to an airport, you would find a lot more individuals there, but actually nobody is resident there, nobody stays there. You're just passing through. uh, of course, not the airports of today, but usual airports.
In an ideal world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yes, so it does have a big impact, and it creates survival. It affects the survival more often than just the absolute density of individuals.
Okay. And I have a second question, which is it was amazing that you mentioned in just 1 year there's this discovery of new species and
Yeah.
all the research work that's going on. So I was just wondering if do you also involve a kind of a citizen science project in this? Do you have school kids contributing
So
or
unfortunately, yeah, not in this part. The citizen science thing started mostly because actually in ICER we have a birding club just like the biology club, and I'm wearing the birding club T-shirt. So so it turned out that and I'm sure in Berhampur also there was not much scope for activities for students, and you get these 150 students, and there's no movies and malls to go to and things like that, and a lot of them turned out to be interested in birds and just bird watching. And slowly we started, people started making checklists, and they got bored watching the same, going to the same places. So the club started expanding and started taking people, other people bird watching. And then we said, okay, why not turn this into a real capacity building citizen science program, so that we can, grid up the entire Tirupati landscape and let the students go to each of these grids and collect data in a more systematic manner. So we started a citizen science program, but that is not really connected to this main, the main research program. But I'm sure we'll hopefully give some insights later.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Robin,
Uh,
Yeah.
this is Rob again.
Oh, yes, sir.
I just have another question. Are there any migratory species of birds that use these sky islands as transit points?
Yes, there are quite a few migratory birds, but in this study I did not consider them, because ecologically they are slightly different. They have longer, more pointed wings usually, and they are able to do these large, long distance migration. But some of the species that I showed you do have some longitudinal movement.
Oh,
So yes, that local migration, those species are included in this, but not the long distance migrants.
the long distance migrants might be using these as transit camps.
For sure, yeah, we do
Oh,
see warblers and
I
several thrushes and so on. That
and the islands, the sky islands.
yes, yes, yes,
Oh, okay, wow. Oh, okay, thank you.
yeah. So I think there was someone else who
Now,
had a question.
yeah,
Yeah,
Chitrak, yeah,
and then there
Chitrak,
is a
please.
question in the chat
Yeah,
box.
one question in the chat box as well. Yeah.
Chitra?
So you talked about the changing frequency when due to the change in habitat. So
That's right.
like, is there any studies that shows any correlation that it will increase or decrease because of some factor? Anything like, or is it
Yeah.
completely random? It increases or decreases.
It's a very, very smart question. Uh, so what happens with frequency, especially with anthropogenic noise, is that birds do either of the two. Either they go higher than the noise or they go lower than the noise. Or they can do a temporal spacing where they don't sing at the time when the noise is more. But actually, if you remember, the questions that we were asking are not really very adaptation kind of this thing. It's more drift driven. So it's just that you have a plastic a trait that can change very quickly, and with just a little bit of isolation, the birds just differ. And sometimes it is higher, and sometimes it is lower. So at the moment, it seems random to me.
But the thing is, we can be sure that the changes that are there, that is to make them like more hearable in than the different than their surroundings. Like if it's
Uh, yes, no. That is one of the criteria uh, that your adapt. This is called the acoustic adaptation hypothesis, where your sound is adapted to your surrounding. But having done that, so that is one of the basic criteria. So having done that, there is a lot more signal that you want to send. So these birds actually are in a very dark, humid kind of environment. So they're not very brightly colored. So the lot of the sexual signal that happens is in breeding song. So the females find the males with just the song. So the song quality is actually very critical. It has a very critical role. Uh, so now you can imagine that there's a selection for greater diversity of songs, and if there's a lot of, and it's a plastic trait, you can imagine that you can have little dialects forming very quickly if there is isolation. Yeah, Chitra,
thank you.
did you
Yeah,
Yeah.
get that? Okay, good.
Robin.
Uh,
Yeah.
While I was on this topic,
Yes.
uh, some years ago, people have reported that the birds there have been incorporating anthropogenic molecules into their repertoire, uh, like eating of plants. Uh,
Right.
so do you see any such thing happening here? It's not
Ah,
just frequency, but
yeah.
perhaps incorporation of some alien sound.
See, it does happen. So, okay, so I have to kind of, the simple answer is that yes, it happens in some species, but I could give you a little bit more detailed answer, which is that there are some species which have very conserved song, and it's not very plastic. But there
Okay.
are some groups which have a very plastic song type, and they keep adding more, increasing variety to their songs. And these are
Uh,
the ones that are likely to incorporate new sounds into their repertoire. Like Mina is very famous in India for that.
yeah. Right. Right. Thank you.
Robin sir, can you just answer the question in the chat box? Can you
Yeah,
see
sure.
that?
So, so I just read out the question: if birds do end up in new wishes in deforestation or something, are there instances of them behaving as invasive species then? Yeah, I think this is a philosophically very interesting question, um, because okay, so I'm gonna wind this, like, take it back a little bit. So you have to first imagine that these birds, some of these birds on Sky Islands, are actually so specific, um, that they have evolved on these mountain tops and they don't move down elevations at all. So then you would think that if there is a new habitat that is there, that they may not be able to kind of adapt to that. But our recent research shows that there are chances that they may be doing that. So it's a very, very, it's a very good question, and it's really our research focus now about how are these birds adapting to these novel habitats that is created there. Yeah, thank you for asking.
Hi, Robin. I have a question related to the song.
Yeah,
Uh, so, you mentioned that a lot of songs are basically culturally inherited. There's
yes,
a lot of horizontal learning.
yes, yes.
So, do you have any system, or let's say a pair of systems, where you have one set of birds where you have song structures which are more heritable, like genetically heritable,
Yeah,
and another system where you have more culturally inherited
yeah,
component?
yeah,
The reason I'm asking is, uh, I would guess that the habitat fragmentation that you see in your study, that would have a greater impact on culturally inherited traits.
yeah, yeah.
Do you concur with that,
Yes,
or
I absolutely concur, and I think that is what our data also shows. So traditionally, people have either studied, these ancient kind of divides, and they've shown that songs are different, or they have looked at anthropogenic differences. There are very few systems that let you do both at the same time. So in some ways, in Western Ghats, we got lucky that we have a system like that, where we are able to compare, both ancient divergence as well as recent anthropogenic. And what we find is that syntax related questions are related parameters change across ancient barriers, but the frequency related ones change more rapidly uh, along anthropogenic. So yeah, it's a good, very good point. Yeah.
I was thinking in this line, I was considering if you have that kind of a system where uh, whatever song, dialect, or whatever is extremely culturally inherited,
Right.
then you should also see that as a almost like a driver of speciation events because it will reinforce divergence, and therefore in that lineage you should see more species diversity.
Uh, yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. Could you just Say that again. I didn't have the last part.
So, so if this cultural divergences
Yeah,
are more affected by, say, habitat fragmentation or heterogeneity in habitat,
yeah,
or simply spatial distribution of the species,
yeah,
then simply by virtue of working as a driver of divergence
yeah.
in a lineage where you have song which is more culturally inherited,
Right.
it will show more species diversity.
Uh, yeah. So this is
I mean,
very
I'm being very simplistic.
yeah. That's yeah. So someone has actually asked me this. They said, so are you suggesting that anthropogenic deforestation will increase cultural diversity and hence lead to speciation? So I think that's a bit tricky, but
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, in principle, it is like more isolated and more time. Definitely, it is increasing some diversity. Whether it you know yeah, for species level thing, it really needs to be established over a long time. But
long
I
time, correct.
yeah, in principle, I agree with your comment that uh, that it does do that. Yeah.
So, any more questions, or shall we wind up the session? Any more questions, please? Feel free to ask.
Okay.
So, I
All right
I
then. Yeah.
guess it's
Yeah.
maybe
I
time
would
to
like to
wind up
thank
the
you
session.
all for hosting and
So,
allowing me to talk here.
Thank you, Robin. We enjoyed.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
a
We
lot.
enjoyed the lecture. Thank you, Robin.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hopefully we get to meet in person
yeah, yeah.
soon.
And I think
I'm sure.
if some of the students have more specific questions later on, they can write to
Of
Robin.
course. Yeah. Sure. All right. All right then. Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Robin.
Bye.
Yeah,
yeah,
bye.
Nice to meet you
Bye.
again, Professor Rao. Bye.
you know,
Bye. Bye.
today's session. Yeah, thank you, Robin, again. Thank you for
Uh,
joining in this first talk of this series. Stay tuned with Lavida. We are bringing up more talks, more in this
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
webinar series.
Thank you.
The other
bye.
ones are habitually in this Friday. We bring about cancer violence. So stay tuned with Lavida. Stay with our social medias. We will update you. Thank you, Robin sir, once again. Thank you, everyone.